Hey everybody, welcome to Algo Expert. In this video, we're going to answer the following behavioral interview question. Describe a time when there was a conflict within your team. How did you help resolve the conflict? Did you do anything to prevent it in the future? So as a matter of fact, there was a time when there was a conflict within my team. This happened back in early March 2019 when I was still a software engineer at Google. And basically, my team had been working on a very large project, a huge feature, and we were getting ready to launch it at Google's annual cloud conference, Google Cloud Next. We were about 2 weeks away from the conference, maybe even 1 week away, a little over a week. And the important thing to note here is that right around a week before such a big conference at Google, Google does something very interesting internally called a code freeze. Basically, any code that's merged into the main repository, the main branch, will not get pushed or deployed to production for about 2 weeks until after the conference. This is meant to ensure that there are no bugs in production during the conference because there's so many teams launching so many features. And so we were about a little over a week from the conference, right around the time when the code freeze was going to happen. I think we were 1 day away from the code freeze. Now, we had finished our feature, everything was ready, we were ready to ship, right? We were very excited, and it had been a pretty stressful time leading up to it since it was such a big project. But so on a Thursday afternoon, one of the other engineers on my team sent out a pull request with a lot of code changes in one file. And these code changes didn't add any functionality. They were not, logic changes. So they were purely syntactic, purely stylistic, if you will, just a refactor of this one file that was admittedly kind of poorly written and that was in dire need of a refactor, this heavy tech debt. But so he sent out this pull request, and the other engineer on my team was reviewing the pull request and just basically flat out rejected it, left a comment, a pretty quick comment, we're not doing this right now, and just rejected it. And I remember this led to a pretty tense argument. It was probably the tensest argument I've seen in a workplace, and I attribute a lot of it to just the heightened stress levels that we had leading up to this launch. But yeah, basically these two other engineers, the one who sent the pull request and the one who reviewed it, just weren't happy with each other, and a few comments were exchanged, and it just wasn't good. Clearly, there was a conflict bottling up and rumbling, and so I'll tell you how I handled that situation. But first, I guess I'll tell you just how I handle any conflict at work, especially. Two things that I think about. First of all, when there's a conflict, I always try to assume good intent in the other party, or in this case, in the two parties involved in the conflict. 99.99% of the time, obviously I'm making up this statistic, but I think it does hold true. Most of the time at work, when someone is disagreeing with somebody else, when someone has a firm position and a firm disagreement with somebody else, they have good intent. Typically, they just genuinely think that their way is the right way for themselves, for the team, for the company, for the organization. And so it's important to assume good intent and not ill intent. The person that you're arguing with or that you're having a conflict with is not out to get you or to screw you over, so to speak. They're just disagreeing with you or having a conflict with you because they want what's best for the team. That's number one. The second thing is always try to find common ground when there's a conflict, because more often than not, since both people or every party involved in a conflict have good intent, there is some sort of common ground. And typically, both parties want the same thing, they just have different ways of getting to it or of accomplishing it. And so here, what I did is I grabbed both of the engineers and pulled them in a room, obviously metaphorically speaking. We went in a conference room, and I kind of walked them through this mental exercise of, let's try to assume good intent in each other, and let's try to figure out what was the actual intent of both of your actions. And it turns out, the intent of the person who sent the pull request was just to improve the code base, right? To make the code base better because this file was kind of objectively poorly written. Everybody agreed on that. Important. This is where we get to the common ground. And that was that person's intent. The intent of the other person was also good. It was just, let's minimize the risk of introducing a bug into production right before the code freeze when we will not be able to fix it afterwards. Because once the code freeze happens, you cannot merge any new code or deploy any new code to production. And so both of them clearly had good intent, and they suddenly saw that once we kind of calmed down and talked it out. And then both of them found common ground in the sense that they both cared about improving the code base. They both agreed that the change that one person made was important, just not necessarily at that time. And they also both didn't want the launch to be, ruined by a bug. And they agreed that, not merging the pull request at that time was better to prevent the bug, but merging it right after, a few days later, when the code freeze had begun, and that code would no longer be deployed to production, that would be fine. So suddenly, it turns out like they were in agreement, and the conflict could have just been avoided. And so, as far as what I did to try to help them, prevent such a conflict from happening in the future, and the lesson that I took from it, because I could have been part of that conflict, was just number one, always go through this mental exercise. These two things, right? Assume good intent and try to find common ground. And also the second thing is try to make sure that your communication is on point, because this conflict that I'm describing here could have been avoided by just better communication. If the engineer who rejected the pull request had just said, hey, I agree with this change. I think this is great. Thanks so much for doing this. But I really think right now is not the good time to merge it into the main repository because the code freeze is about to happen, and we have to ensure that there's absolutely no risk of a bug getting into production. If he had said that, then, communicated more properly, then the conflict could have maybe been avoided. So those were the two things that we kind of all left that conference room with, and that's how I handled this conflict and how I would handle any other conflict in the workplace.